All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar, TOPS. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jessie King, a tobacco control researcher at the University of Utah, and I'm the guest MC for TOPS today. So TOPS is being organized by Catherine McLean from Temple University, C. Shang from The Ohio State University, Michael Pesco from the Georgia State University, and Justin White at the University of California, San Francisco. So today's seminar will be 1 hour with questions asked by the moderator and the discussant. The audience may pose questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from these questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable comments. Please keep the comments professional and related to the research being discussed. Comments meeting seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they are not read aloud. Your comments are very much appreciated. Today's presentation is being video recorded and will be made available on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. So now I will turn it over to today's moderator, Catherine McLean from Temple University, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Today, Dr. David Levy will lead a workshop presentation entitled A Workshop on Tobacco Antitrust Analysis, a case study of the Altria-Juul merger. David Levy is a professor of oncology at Georgetown University. He has published more than 300 papers in a variety of professional publications, including the American Economic Review, JAMA, and Lancet. Levy has been principal investigator of grants from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the World Health Organization, the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Bloomberg Gates Foundation, the European Union, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. He is currently a principal investigator on one of the FDA Tobacco Centers of Regulatory Science, TCORs, the NCI CISNET Lung Group, and the NCI International Tobacco Control ITC Policy Evaluation Project. Levy currently oversees the design and development of the SIM-Smoke Tobacco Control Policy Simulation Model. He has developed models for 12 U.S. states and more than 70 countries. He has recently developed models incorporating smokeless tobacco and e-cigarettes to examine the public health impact of public policies affecting their use. Our discussant today is C. Shang. Dr. Levy will be presenting his research in 2 segments. We will have a pause halfway through to allow for questions. Dr. Levy, thank you for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all for attending today. Today's talk will involve an industry analysis of the nicotine delivery product industry, focusing on the Altria-Juul merger. No conflicts of interest to declare. Today's talk is based on work funded by the National Cancer Institute to the ITC. I've also received other grants from NCI and PIO TCORs and funding from Bloomberg Foundation, WHO. Today's discussion is based on papers with many co-authors to whom I am indebted. However, the views today represent my own. You may be familiar with my recent work, which mostly involves modeling and empirical studies of tobacco, e-cigarette use, policy, and public health impacts. However, in my previous life, my PhD is in economics, and my dissertation and early publications focused on market competition and organization of the firm. I actually worked at the Federal Trade Commission and served as an expert witness on antitrust mergers cases. So in a sense, I'm getting back to my roots. And although the work I'm going to discuss today hasn't received as much attention, I would consider it some of maybe my most important work. And I say that for a couple reasons. First, to my knowledge, I may be the only person who's doing actual economic-oriented industry analysis that is publishing in the public health industry. Secondly, I think that this area has not received much attention, but is very important, as I'm going to argue today. And in particular, in the next few months, there will be an administrative hearing on the Altria-Juul merger case, arguably one of the events that may have an extremely important impact on the future of harm reduction. My work today is based on 5 papers, and the first 2 are in tobacco regulatory science. I'll mention that I had submitted these to some of the more well-known journals, but I think, frankly, I think it's difficult to get strict economic analyses other than tax and price work, the more health economics oriented work published in those journals. So I'd like to give a special shout out to tobacco regulatory science. Now, de-emphasizing the economics, I did publish a paper talking about the Juul-Altria deal in tobacco control, and sent a follow-up paper that actually talked about the FTC case against Altria-Juul. And that paper, I think, was too much economics oriented. So thanks again to tobacco regulatory science. Now, the most complete description of my work, which really focuses on the economics and the antitrust Juul-Altria case in detail, an expansion of the TRS paper, is in the Journal of Competition Law and Economics. So today I'm going to focus on market structure and competition because I feel they play a very important underlying role. As you see in the diagram here, market structure in competition affects government policies. Government policies affect market structure in competition, which in turn, arguably through lobbying and the way policies are implemented, affect government policy itself. In addition, market structure and competition has important impacts on the nicotine delivery product market. In particular, these impacts have been seen most recently in e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, and are important to the underlying harm reduction debate. Indeed, I would argue that, I originally, as an aside, I originally thought about calling this talk the underbelly, because I think, much of the debates surrounding harm reduction relate to different views on the role of markets. And what I mean by that is that those people, economists in particular, and those who have more libertarian views, tend to particularly look at e-cigarettes as important, whereas many of the more traditional people in tobacco control look at the growth of e-cigarettes with more concern. But yet there isn't much discussion of the underlying markets in the literature. So to frame this in a particular way, previous to 2005, the cigarette industry was the primary focus of tobacco control. Cigarette companies were minimally involved with other tobacco products. Now, using 2005 as kind of a watershed date, but there's more gradually, since 2005, the industry environment has changed. And since smokers use a variety of products, and we've seen growth in other markets, including little cigars, smokeless tobacco, and most notably NVPs, nicotine vaping products, also known as cigarettes. And I'm going to frame today's talk as a tale of these two markets to help understand the different perspectives. I'm going to discuss the pre-2005 market first, then the post-2005 market, including a discussion of the recent Altria-Juul merger. The industry analysis will be based on the economics and marketing literature, and specifically on the DOJ-FTC merger guidelines. In the merger guidelines, which I think provide a particularly good framework for analysis, there are 4 steps. First is market definition. You need to define the market in order to determine the relevant firms and the market shares. And this analysis is usually based on whether or not there are effective substitutes in terms of current firms and entry. This analysis often involves studies of demand. Next is industry concentration, which provides the market shares individually and combined. And in particular, you hear a lot about the 4-firm concentration ratio or the Herfindahl index. Next are entry barriers. These are important because they restrict the ability of firms to enter and bring down prices. It's kind of a feedback loop. These are important also to the initial market definition, but these are factors that are also important in conjunction with industry concentration in determining whether or not firms have market power. Examples are reputation, essential inputs, having necessary technological and marketing knowledge, and overcoming regulatory constraints. Finally, to the extent it's available, antitrust analyses focus on market conduct. They examine whether firms engage in anti-competitive behavior. That includes pricing behavior, including coordinated pricing, price discrimination, and predatory pricing. So now focusing on the pre-2005 market. Again, this is the market where you could really focus, I would argue, on the cigarette market alone. And this is justified by previous merger cases that have looked at cigarette mergers. But up until the mid-2000s, there were few perceived substitutes for cigarettes, as indicated by demand studies, where demand was generally found to be relatively inelastic. In merger cases, as you'll see, the market was defined particularly in terms of 6 firms that composed the market, which now have been reduced pretty much to 3 major firms. And we've seen the market as being concentrated since at least going back to the 1950s. Since the 1950s, the market has become more concentrated with the growth in Marlboro and subsequent increases in Philip Morris's market share, and also industry mergers. The industry is now highly concentrated with Altria, BAT, and Imperial, the 3 main cigarette companies. This gives you a graph of the concentration over time, and I want to point out several key events. One is the 1971 ban on television and radio advertising. And if you look at the literature on the cigarette industry, there's been some very interesting articles that state that this ban was something that was encouraged by the cigarette companies themselves. And there are strong suggestions that this ban may have limited entry because television and radio advertising are an important source of information on new products. On top of that, the ban allowed, and we still have today, advertising through displays at retail, which you'll see is very important in the cigarette market. Another important event was the price wars, Marlboro Friday, in which Philip Morris reduced prices as there was new entry into the industry. In more recent years, the FTC has allowed two major mergers. One, Reynolds' merger with Brown and Williamson, and two, Reynolds' merger with Lorillard. As you could see in the bottom right-hand corner, the market is and really has been highly concentrated for at least the last 30 years. Okay, so we have a highly concentrated industry, but do we have entry barriers? And there's a substantial economics literature here, and in that literature, at least 4 types of entry barriers have shown prominently. One of those is reputation. That is, firms themselves have reputations. There's a certain amount of brand loyalty to specific products. Marlboro in particular has been quite successful at developing that brand loyalty. Second is the proliferation of products. And again, Marlboro provides a very interesting example in that there are now many varieties of Marlboro cigarettes, but you see varieties provided by each of the major cigarette companies. And in the economics literature, there are arguments to suggest that this preempts other firms. In other words, fill spaces that other firms might enter the industry. Next is retail slotting allowances. These are allowances paid primarily to retail outlets, such as 7-Elevens, supermarkets, and so on, for shelf space. These allowances not only buy up shelf space, but they're used for price and display promotions, which again feed back to the prominence of reputation. The economic literature has argued quite strongly that these slotting allowances can and do act as an entry barrier. I would also mention there are arguments for the efficiency of these, but for the purposes here, I think it's fair to say that retail slotting allowances have played an important role in the cigarette market, and as we'll see later, can potentially play an important role in the broader market of tobacco products. And finally, there's legal compliance. That is, cases have been brought against the cigarette companies, and also the cigarette companies have had to deal with tobacco control, which is arguably has limited some of the smaller firms and new entrants from coming into the market and taking a greater role. Finally, there's been a really nice literature on market conduct. There's been quite a few studies looking at and arguing that the cigarette market. And these are, pre-2005 studies arguing that the market can be characterized as having coordinated behavior, which in a concentrated market is quite conceivable, whether it's implicit or explicit collusion. It leads to certain pricing patterns which have been found in studies to be indicative of coordinated pricing. In addition, there's an interesting literature on tax increases that shows that as characterized in anti-competitive markets, there has been the ability to raise price more than the tax increase, something not likely in competitive markets. In addition, there have been studies on predatory pricing. As mentioned before, the Marlboro instances of around 1991. And you see a literature on price discrimination, not only in the economics in the economics literature itself, but you see substantial evidence of price discrimination in the tobacco control literature. And this is conceivably important, especially if you're raising prices to relatively high levels, because it's a way of keeping open the market to more price-sensitive customers. Okay, so that's the pre-2005 market. That's the market that many people in tobacco control have seen. Those people that have focused on the cigarette market, they see this market and they see the power of the cigarette firms, and arguably this is one of the reasons for the skepticism that we see among many in tobacco control about markets today. But now I'm going to look at the post-2005 market, and skipping ahead, I'm going to argue that that market has, while maybe not well understood by many, has become much more competitive. What we've seen since 2005 is increased use of smokeless tobacco, little cigars, and e-cigarettes, both alone and together with cigarettes. In other words, there's a much closer relationship between cigarettes and these other products. If you look at some of the more recent demand studies for cigarettes, you find that the elasticity, the own price elasticity, is found to be much higher. In addition, you find relatively high cross-price elasticities, in particular between cigarettes and e-cigarettes, evidence of the closer relationship of these different products. Now, if you look at industry behavior, the cigarette industry is still highly concentrated. But what we've seen is the cigarette companies recognizing the importance of this interdependence between cigarette and smokeless tobacco use in particular, have bought up the major tobacco companies and have also added their own smokeless and snus products. Also, Altria purchased one of the major cigar companies. In addition, the cigarette companies have entered the e-cigarette market through merger and through de novo growth, and really were not able to gain a large market share, at least until Altria purchased its stake in Juul. Finally, the cigarette companies have entered the heated tobacco product market, most notably IQOS, which has recently been granted the right to market their product in the United States by the FDA. And this also, I think, can be viewed as an important indication of not only the importance of smokers switching to alternative, potentially less harmful products, but also the need to compete with the e-cigarette market. So in sum, the market has become much more competitive with more product overlap. And I would argue that the market can now be defined as the nicotine vaping product market. Turning now briefly to the e-cigarette market, what we've seen there is evidence of strong competition. As you see in the upper right-hand corner, there's been constant change in the shares of different e-cigarette firms. There's been substantial entry in addition. We've also seen rapid innovation in going from first to fourth generation e-cigarette products. Prices have fallen, at least through 2007, and you don't see the kind of price uniformity and stability of price that you've seen in the cigarette market. In addition, products now aren't just sold over retail as they were largely before 2005, but are now sold over the internet and vape shops. Interestingly also, stock prices have, which traditionally have been considered a great investment and stable and also and rising and so on, have really plummeted starting in 2000, right around the time that Juul grew. So this gives you kind of an overview of the market, and what it shows is there's two different aspects or components to the market: devices. I've argued that devices should be the focus in competitive analyses. But what's important here is you see two groups of firms: cigarette manufacturers and independents. And these groups have clearly been competing strongly with each other and competing over the different sectors of the market: retail, other tobacco, vape shops, and the internet. So initially, we saw most use was through smokers. So again, this is through the indication of the important overlap of the cigarette and e-cigarette market. And some of my work and others suggest that those who are using e-cigarettes instead may have initiated into smoking. So again, it's not just current smokers, but also likely smokers. Often what we see is a lot of, switching between brands, indication of new products, particularly as each new generation of device comes out and becomes a better substitute for cigarettes. We see more and more switching from cigarettes to e-cigarettes. And again, important is that consumers arguably started buying over the internet. One could argue that the internet itself is an important part of the growth of e-cigarettes, but also vape shops have played an important role. I'll discuss this more later as I discuss the Altria-Juul merger, but clearly these sectors have been important, and this is some data from Wells Fargo. And I would point out, and I'll mention this later, most of the data that we get on market share is for mass market retail. But as you see here, online and vape shops have, at least up through 2017, played a very important role also. For the most part, mass market retail had up through 2017 been 40% of the market, but online was somewhere near 25%, and vape shops had been near 40% of the market. We've seen some decline in recent years as the FDA has clamped down, and we'll talk more about some of the changes since then. But at this point, I'd like to stop and open up for any questions.
Thank you so much, David. And we encourage our audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A to pose your questions and comments. I think I'll pause now and have C ask some of her questions.
Yes, thank you, David, for the great information and presentation. So I have a few questions. The first one is about the market definition. I think that's very important. So based on your presentation, you are saying that now, because there are many different products in the market now, for example, the vaping products, heat-not-burn products, as well as the cigars. And do you think we are at the turning point of defining the market, as you said, as a nicotine tobacco market? So from that perspective, when we evaluate the market concentration, so now do we have to take count of all these different products? If that's the case, so how do we evaluate concentration? And that's also related to the Federal Trade Commission. So if FTC sees your point and looking at the market as a pooled market of many products, they may say, okay, it's not as concentrated as before. So that may support the merger of Altria and Juul. So do you have any thoughts or comment on that?
Well, that's a great question, and in my work, I've talked about the concentration in submarkets, and what I'll be arguing later in regard to the Altria-Juul merger is we need to look at those submarkets, and what you'll see is those markets, except possibly for e-cigarettes, are highly concentrated now. For e-cigarettes, we have less information because we don't have market share for online and vape shops. But what we need to look at there, I think it's fair to say that the e-cigarette market is nowhere near as concentrated as the other markets, but we do see a movement towards greater concentration. And we need to look at that, and we need to get better data to look at that. So to answer your question, I think we need to look at submarkets and then look at the potential role, in this case in particular, of Altria in each of those markets, because when we look at the Altria-Juul merger.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think, based on my training in economics, we all assume that the manufacturers or companies, they would maximize their profits. So now say they have different types of products, the cigarettes, heated not burn, like IQOS, and also e-cigarettes. Do we have information on which product is more profitable and how the companies may strategize on the pricing and thereby, gain more profits?
Yeah, well, we do know that cigarettes are highly profitable. I mean, that's been pretty well established in the literature. And I would argue that they're still, for the most part, the cash cow. At the same time, I would argue that the potential for profits is greatest and I would argue that smokeless tobacco likely is quite profitable. And then I would argue that heated tobacco products have greater potential, at least to cigarette companies, for greater profits because of the more proprietary kinds of information and patents involved in those products. So I think those products will be sold primarily by the cigarette companies, which creates an interesting dynamic vis-a-vis the e-cigarette market.
Yeah, I guess, related, I'm quite interested in seeing how the companies would respond to policies differently by product types, because we've been arguing about how to regulate these products by their relative harms. So in case that the regulatory environment goes that way with different levels of regulatory actions on those products, the companies may, there may be rooms, in my opinion, to allow the companies to strategize their response.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, maybe I should move on to discuss the Altria-Juul merger, because you'll see the importance of that. And I think what you're saying is very important. And that is that not only should the FDA be looking at the Altria-Juul merger, and more generally, the impact of their policies on the cigarette and e-cigarette market, but also the FDA should, and tobacco control should be looking very closely at what's happening.
Thank you. That's all my comments. So Catherine, do you want to take over? Because I see several Q&As and your own questions.
Great. Yes, I think we'll have a couple of questions from the audience, if that's all right, David. Could you please explain the plummeting share of market held by vape shops in just the past 2 years? Is there a specific reason for that?
Well, I don't think we know the reason for that. I mean, clearly there's concern in terms of the FDA regulations, which could be quite stringent as they relate to vape shops. You notice in the slide, I have a question mark there. I'm not sure we know how much of a decline there is because we don't have we should have, but we don't have good information there.
Great, thank you. Could you discuss the role of patents as determinants of progress or hampering these changes that you're seeing?
Well, that's quite an involved topic in and of itself. Clearly, patents are important when it comes to heated tobacco products. It's less, as witnessed by the fact that there's a case by BAT against Altria about patents for heated tobacco products. The role in e-cigarettes is much less clear, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I talk more about the market.
Great, thank you. Just one comment that Euromonitor reports that in Canada, vape shops account for almost 50% of the market in 2020. I think that's speaking to maybe heterogeneity across countries. If you have any sort of thoughts on that, or that would be great.
I think that's important. And again, what does that indicate to you? The importance of FDA taking into account these kinds of factors as they develop regulations.
Great. All right. Just one last question from one of our board members. Just do you have any? I think the purpose of the question is yes. Do you have any thoughts on how reliable the data are that we have, and are there any holes? I think you've maybe alluded that there's room for more data collection.
Definitely. And I'll talk a little bit about that now.
Thank you.
So moving on, so basically I've argued this kind of tale of two markets. That is, we clearly had a highly concentrated market in cigarettes, which provides, for the view of the cigarette market as one where, where cigarette markets have control. But at the same time, since e-cigarettes have come onto the scene, we have a market that could be much better, in my view, characterized by Schumpeter's description of the dynamics of capitalism as the process of creative destruction, or the term you hear in the tobacco control literature, disruptive markets. And Juul is a prime example of that. So far, government regulation has been minimal, but if I have time, I'll talk more about that. As I mentioned, IQOS is now playing an important role. Now, I just wanted to quickly give you a snapshot or a graph of the growth in Juul, which again is indicative of the ability of a firm to go from practically nothing to having a large share, which has since declined in recent years. Again, indicative of the importance of competition, and in particular, the churning of market shares. This data, however, is based on retail sales. Again, we don't have good information in terms of internet and vape shop sales, where Juul has also played a role. Okay, so now finally getting to the Altria-Juul merger, where Altria bought up a 35% stake in Juul. There was a 6-year agreement. There were various restrictions on the role of Altria. However, I would argue that they were in a position to play a very strong role in Juul. And important to that deal is soon after the deal, and Altria declared its intention to abandon its e-cigarette business, namely the Mark products. And their part of the deal was that Altria would provide Juul favored treatment in terms of inserts in their package. In other words, if you're going to quit, try Juul, and also to provide retail shelf space. Again, arguably important in terms of the retail sector. Now, the FTC unanimously challenged that merger. In fact, they refer to the deal as a merger and treat it as a merger as such, indicating, again, the importance of the relationship established by that deal. Now, unlike my analysis, the FTC limits the market to closed system retail e-cigarettes. When you do that, you get an extremely highly concentrated market and, in some sense, better defined entry barriers. You avoid some of the problems that C mentioned in trying to weight the market shares in different parts of the overall market. However, I would point out, we did send our work to the FTC before they challenged the merger. Many of their arguments about entry barriers are similar to those that I'm going to make. So let's move on to that. Before I do that, let me give brief mention that, although I'm going to argue that the Altria-Juul merger has strong potential for anti-competitive consequences, at the same time, there are potential efficiencies and efficiencies that should arguably be looked at in evaluating the merger. And, you know, given the time constraints, I'll just list these here, and if anyone has questions, I'll come back to these later on. So let me pause a second so you can look at these. These are all reasons why, in particular, potentially the merger can help sustain Juul and provides them finances to potentially expand their product and give them retail shelf space. Okay, so now moving on to the potential anti-competitive concerns. First, market share. Looking at the cigarette markets, they're still highly competitive, with Altria having a 54% share. Usually 35% is enough for the FTC to consider the potential for dominant firm kind of behavior. Also, especially since Altria bought up major smokeless tobacco companies, both Altria, I should say, and BAT, formerly Reynolds, bought up smokeless tobacco companies. They also have commanding shares in that market. Altria has also bought up 35% of the cigar market. And finally, for now, Altria sells only heated tobacco products. And as I've argued, the cigarette companies are likely to continue to control that market. Again, market concentration for e-cigarettes is much less well known. What we do know, however, that as Juul grew, Altria's shares really were reduced, suggesting that the only way to beat the competition, if you can't beat them, join them. And that seems to be what they did. But again, our knowledge of the shares in that part of the market is needed, but we don't have that information. I would argue that many of the same entry barriers that you see in the pre-2005 cigarette market, you see at least for cigarettes, smokeless, and cigars. So again, there's strong potential for anti-competitive behavior in each of those submarkets alone. Entry barriers for e-cigarettes are much less clear. As we said, there's been rapid growth. There's minimal startup costs, or at least until now, there's been minimal startup costs. And marketing has been easier because much of the marketing occurs through the internet, social media, and word of mouth. However, I would argue that retail is likely to play an increasingly important role in the e-cigarette market. And as a consequence, the cigarette companies are well positioned to take advantage of that through the control they get through slotting allowances. Also, the ability to at least have the option of switching Marlboro smokers to Juul creates an entry barrier in and of itself to other entrants and even to the growth of other firms in the market. However, the primary entry barrier, and we have yet to see how it's going to play out, although I think we've seen the effects, as we said, in the vaping market, is likely to be regulatory hurdles. That is, gaining FDA approval is now required for new products and also for many of the existing products, which is not only very expensive, but also takes a lot of time. And I would argue that the major cigarette firms are again in a strong position because of their experience in dealing with regulations, in particular dealing with the FDA. So in terms of conduct, what I would argue is, and what I have argued, I should say, is that we have all these highly concentrated firms, but Altria is in a particularly strong position to act as the dominant firm, much as they did, I think, in the pre-2005 market, but now they can do that over a wider range of products. It's not clear they've done that yet, but I think especially as and if the merger is approved, then they will have increasing ability to do that through the slotting allowances that limit other firms from retail, through targeting marketing to entrants and non-followers, as they've done in the past, to preempt other firms because of their ability, their likely greater ability to get new products approved through the FDA. So if they see that a particular firm is quote unquote misbehaving, they can target them with another product, and also through the interrelated pricing of products. And in particular here, I would argue they have potentially important impacts through their pricing of heated tobacco products vis-a-vis e-cigarettes, which I think it's fair to say are likely to be the two products where there is the most competitive overlap, even more than cigarettes, but also important vis-a-vis cigarettes, so as to be used by the cigarette companies to protect their products. As we've seen earlier, I think that Altria in particular, but the cigarette companies are in a good position to price discriminate in the various submarkets at the expense of others. In other words, to lower prices where they see competition, especially competition that affects their cigarette profits. Now, I've focused on the industry behavior, but this is also very important from a public health standpoint. You know, many of us would argue that, especially if you believe, as I do, that e-cigarettes and to a lesser extent, but also heated tobacco products are substantially less harmful from cigarettes. Discouraging consumers from switching can have important public health impacts. And again, the cigarette companies can do this not only through pricing, but marketing practices. In addition, the cigarette companies can promote the use of, I would argue, the less safe heated tobacco products over e-cigarettes. Again, potentially yielding less harm reduction. The cigarette companies have been effective at marketing towards youth and young adults. I think that this is also a concern from the public health point of view. They can also blur information on the relative harm of different products, most notably through the type of warnings that are put on products, which has been something which has received recent FDA attention. And finally, through their lobbying and instituting court cases to protect cigarette sales, while at the same time potentially discouraging e-cigarettes. So What I've argued is that the market has substantially changed since 2005, and we now see the potential for strong competition. And at the same time, however, we see the potential, especially through the Altria-Juul merger, where Altria now has an important foothold also in the e-cigarette market, to influence the overall nicotine product delivery market, with Altria having a large market share, and there being important entry barriers, regulatory barriers, as well as some of the other barriers I've mentioned. Altria could effectively act as a dominant firm over the overall nicotine delivery product market. And I think this raises questions about the competition that we'll see in the future from the current independent firms and potential entrance into the market, thereby increasing prices, targeting marketing, and reducing product product innovation. Sorry, I'm rushing a bit here. Rather than spend time talking about this slide, although I'll be glad to if questions come up, I want to leave time for questions, limited as it may be. I think it's very important that we do not only empirical studies, but formal types of modeling of cigarette behavior in the market. In other words, use the traditional models of profit maximization of firms within an industry to look at the 4 Ps: price, product, promotion, and place, and then use that to look at the industry response to regulation, and then also distinguish the incentive of single product, i.e. independence, versus the incentives of companies such as Altria and the traditional cigarette companies to gauge the impact of independence on competition. And again, this is important from a public health as well as an anti-competitive kind of concern. Competition, or rather control of e-cigarettes firms, is not a foregone conclusion. Much will depend on the Altria-Juul merger, but regardless, industry structure and behavior have important influences on the effectiveness of tobacco control policies and should be considered. Those of you who are interested in following up on this, please email me. I'd be glad to discuss with you. And in particular, those of you that are interested in economic and empirical analysis of industry behavior, and I'd be particularly interested. So sorry for rushing at the end, but I hope there's at least a bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, David. I think we have a couple of questions, and please, audience members, if you'd like to use the Q&A, please do so. We'll probably stay a couple of minutes extra just to be respectful of everyone's time, but try and fit in some questions. So we have one question. The cigarette companies are talking a good game now regarding their support for transitioning the marketplace to non-combustible products. Do these statements make any difference? Should we place any weight on these statements?
Well, I think that I think Well, let me put it this way. I have less, I think that Altria, I have less faith in those statements from Altria, and I distinguish here Philip Morris from Altria, Philip Morris International from Altria. I think, you know, we're just going to have to wait and see. You know, we should always be wary that cigarette companies have strong potential to protect their profits, primarily in cigarettes and secondarily in heated tobacco products. But where we've seen the advances in terms of harm reduction, we've seen up till now, at least, primarily in e-cigarettes. What's going to happen into the future? We just need to watch closely and see what happens and continually evaluate.
Great. I guess, C, do you have any other questions? If not, I have one just quick question to add.
No, go ahead, Catherine.
I guess, David, do you have any thoughts on what would be useful research that the experimental or the quasi-experimental research community could add to this discussion? I know you've given us a really great amount of information here today, but is there something you think would be particularly useful for us as the research community to contribute to this discussion right now?
Well, you know, I think that, you know, in the previous slide, I've laid out some of the areas where I think it's important to contribute. And, you know, I would add that through the T-Cores, we're now looking at price discrimination practices, and importantly, through ITC, we're looking at the role of particular brands, which is important in gauging the effect, and looking at how different brands have played a role and do play a role in how consumers evaluate different products. And we've tried to do that both through the surveys that we've done, and also through the experimental marketplace kind of evaluations being done by Warren Bickel and others.
That's great. So I guess just following up on that, I guess one role that you see this community playing is potentially using more of these experimental designs to develop marketplaces that maybe we don't see in the current day, but we could think about what's going to happen in the future. Just trying to think about what this research community might be able to add. And I think that answers my question. So thank you. I guess we just have one.
Let me just add one other thing.
Sure.
I think it's important, you know, before I think C mentioned about Canada, or somebody had mentioned about Canada, we need to look at other countries too and see what's happening and see how our regulations are having impacts on companies and how they're in turn reacting. These are going to be central to how things play out in the future. You know, this is, you know, I do modeling, but I always warn that there's a high degree of uncertainty, and we need to be continually monitoring markets. We need to be looking at regulations in different countries and how they affect industry behavior. So anyway, sorry.
No, that's great. I really appreciate that. I think there's a question, one more question from the audience. There's perhaps a perception that maybe regulators are favoring larger companies versus consumers. Is that an accurate characterization, do you think, or do you think there is more of a nuanced perspective of the regulator? I guess we're thinking about the United States here.
I don't think we know that yet, and part of the reason we don't know that yet is because we don't know yet how FDA regulations are going to play out in terms of the ability of well-established firms versus, you know, the smaller firms, how that's going to play out. And until we know that, I think we're not going to know how things are going to play out in terms of the competition that has been important in providing consumers with new, less harmful products.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Levy, for the presentation, and to the moderator and the discussant. Finally, thank you to the audience of 80 people for your participation. Our next seminar speaker will be Dr. Mariana Gerstenbluth, giving a presentation on March 18th titled Repugnant Warnings, Addiction, and Rational Choice. After leaving the seminar, you will have an opportunity to complete a survey on your satisfaction with the seminar today. We appreciate the feedback. You will also receive an email with instructions for how you can receive a certificate for your attendance today. Thanks again for participating, and have a top-notch weekend.